Prudent Scholars in association with Goa Headmasters Association.
Hello students, myself Bharati Thakur, science teacher at Shree Damodar Vidyalaya English High School, Margao. Today I am going to deal with the chapter Control and Coordination, which carries 4 marks. So let us begin students. We have a notion that if we see something moving, it's alive. So movements can be related to different things. Here we can see a seed growing into a plant or a child growing into an adult. These movements are related to growth. We have no control on these kind of movements. There are some other movements which can be controlled by us, like we can see the movements in these organisms, like we can see a leopard running, cow grazing, or the children playing. These are the movements which can be controlled by us, which are under our control, right? So to perform these activities, the different parts of our body are involved, right? So so in this chapter we would be studying how we can control these activities in the chapter Control and Coordination. So need of control and coordination in animals. Organism is in direct contact with its environment. So any changes in its surrounding have an influence on its body. To maintain the balance between the environmental factors and body functions, there is a need of such controlling and coordinating system that works for the welfare of the organism. Next is stimuli. Stimuli is plural and stimulus is singular. Now what do you mean by stimuli? Whatever information that we receive from the environment, that is called as stimuli, to which our body would respond to. Here are a few examples of stimuli, like we have the chemicals in air. Now these chemicals can be from the food that has been cooked in the kitchen, or it can even be the garbage smell that we usually get, right? So those are also the chemicals which are released in the environment, which is sensed by the nose, right? The changes in the temperature change that we see in the environment, like it can be a cold temperature or the hot temperature, right, around us. So when it is cold, we tend to shiver, correct? So that is the body movement with respect to the environmental changes that we see here. When it is heat, we tend to sweat, right? Pain, sound, these are the other stimuli that we receive from the environment. So let us see the definition of the stimuli, students. The change in the environment to which the living organism respond are called stimuli. So it is the change in the environment to which we are responding. So those changes would be called as stimuli. Here are some examples, like we have heat, cold, sound, smell, taste, touch. These are the few examples of stimuli. Living organisms respond to the stimuli in the form of body movements. So how do we respond to the stimuli? We respond to the stimuli in the form of body movements. Like in the previous slide, I have already said that if it is a cold environment around, we tend to shiver. So that is the body movement that is shown by us in response to the stimuli. Okay? Yes. Now here are the different sense organs which help us to receive the stimuli. Now we know we have basically 5 sense organs: sense of hearing, right? Sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of sight, and sense of taste. So we have the organs which help us to get this or receive the senses, right? So that is, we have ear for the sense of hearing, nose for the sense of smell, skin for the sense of touch, eyes for the sense of sight, and the tongue for the sense of taste. So this is how we would receive the stimuli from the environment. Okay? Next comes receptors. Now what are these receptors and where are they located? They are located in the sense organs which receive the stimuli and pass the message to the brain or spinal cord through the sensory nerves. So these are the receptors which are found in the sense organs. So let us consider my finger. I am touching a hot object. So here in my finger there will be the receptor which would receive the stimulus of heat, right? And that information will then be passed to the brain or the spinal cord through the sensory nerves. So, the nerves which carry the information from your sense organ to the either the brain or the spinal cord, which forms the part of a central nervous system, is called sensory nerve. Okay? Here are some examples of receptors, students. These are the different receptors which are found in different sense organs. So, photoreceptors are the receptors which are found in the eyes, which help us to detect light. Phonoreceptors are the receptors in the ears, which help to detect sound. Olfactory receptors are the receptors in the nose, which help us to detect smell. Gustatory receptors in the tongue to detect taste, and tangoreceptors in the skin to detect touch. So, these are the different types of receptors which are found in the sense organs, right? I hope this is clear to you, students. Okay. So, let us move to the next part of the chapter, coordination. Okay. So, now what is this coordination? For a proper response to a stimulus, many organs in the body should work together. The working together of various organs in an organism to produce response to a stimulus is called coordination. It means that when we are responding to a stimulus, there have to be coordination between different parts of our body. Only then we can respond in a correct manner, right? So, that is what we mean by coordination. Now, students, I have an example for you so that you can understand this better. Okay, so what can you see here? A dog chasing a man, right? A dog is chasing a man. So, man, he locates the danger, he is seeing the dog who is running after him, right? So, that is the sense of sight. So, your brain will interpret the information, correct? And then it will give the order to your leg muscles that you have to run away from the dog, correct? But then what if the leg muscles are not coordinating with the order that is been given by the brain? Right. So, if there is no proper coordination, so if the leg muscle says, no, I am not going to move from my place, or what if the leg muscles, they are moving towards the dog instead of moving away from the dog, correct? So, there have to be a proper coordination between the different organs of our body so that we have a proper response to a given stimulus. So, this is what we mean by coordination. In animals, the control and coordination is done by nervous system and endocrine system. So, these are the two ways by which the control and coordination is done in animals, that is the nervous system and endocrine system. In plants, control and coordination is done by chemical substances called plant hormones. So, in plants, control and coordination is by plant hormone. But students, here we would be restricting our discussion only to animals because the control and coordination for plants is deleted for you, okay, from this chapter. So, this portion is deleted. So, we are concentrating only on control and coordination in animals, right. So, now let us first see the nervous system. Nervous system. In animals, this control and coordination is carried out by nervous and muscular system. Now, why muscular system? In the previous slide where I had shown you a dog chasing a man, we have seen that your eyes sense a danger and your leg muscles have to move, right? Only then there will be proper response to the stimulus. So, there has to be proper coordination between the nervous and the muscular system, right? So, that is why the muscles also are important here, muscular system. Human nervous system consists of two parts. They are central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Okay? So, human nervous system consists of two parts, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Now, what does this central nervous system consist of? Central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord. Okay? While the peripheral nervous system consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Now, what are these cranial nerves, students? Cranial nerves are the nerves which arise from the brain. Okay? So, we have 12 pair of cranial nerves. These are nerves which are arising from the brain, and the spinal nerves are the nerves which are arising from the spinal cord, right? From the name itself you can understand that the spinal nerves are the nerves which are arising from the spinal cord. We have 31 pair of spinal nerves. I hope this is clear to you students, right? Okay. So here you can see the central nervous system which is comprising of brain and spinal cord, right? Okay. So here you have the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system comprises of brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system comprises of the nerves which are coming from the or which are arising from the brain and the spinal cord. So I think this would be clear to you, right? Okay. Next we need to understand is structure of neuron or nerve cell. Okay. Now what is this nerve cell? We know all the tissues are made up of cells. So same way here nervous tissue will also be made up of cell. So the cell which makes up the nervous tissue is called a nerve cell, also called as neuron. Another term that or another name that we can use for the nerve cell is neuron. Okay. So first let us understand the structure of nerve cell. Now this diagram is very important students because this is usually asked for drawing. Now this diagram you can either draw it horizontally or vertically as you wish. Okay. Now this diagram I have taken directly from the textbook so that there is no much confusion, right? Now let us understand the structure of the nerve cell. Let me compare this nerve cell with my hand. Okay, let me compare it with my hand. So the important part of this nerve cell is the cell body. I can compare it with my palm, right? The cell body which is having a dark colored structure in the center which is called as nucleus. So nucleus will be present in the center. All other cell organelles and the cytoplasm, all those things would be present in the cell body. Cell body is also called as cyton. Another term that we can use for cell body is cyton. Now from the cell body some small branches are seen arising. You can see here in the slide. Yes, these are the small branches which are seen arising from the cell body. These branches are called as dendrites. Okay, what are they called as? They are called as dendrites. One of the branch would be long like this one. Okay, so that long branch which is arising from the cell body is called axon. So I can compare it with my arm students. This is the cell body, dendrites and the axon, correct? Now we know the cell will end at some point, correct? So the endings of this axon are called as nerve endings. Simple, right? Okay, so let me compare it with the hand. Okay, I have a picture of the hand here. So we have a palm. Your palm can be compared with the cell body, the center nucleus which is a dark colored structure, right? Your fingers can be compared to the dendrites which are arising from the cell body. One of the extension or the projection is a long one which is called an axon. The endings of the axon would be called as nerve endings, right? Now the nerve cell is the longest cell in our body. It can measure even up to 100 centimeters. Okay, so this length of the nerve cell basically is determined by the length of the axon, because we know this axon is the long extension which is coming from the cell body, right? Now let us see the function of the different parts of this nerve cell. Okay, now when I touch a hot object, let's consider I am touching a hot object, my finger will sense the heat, right? The receptors which are found in the fingers will receive the stimulus, and then the stimulus that is received by the receptor will then be passed to the dendrites of the nerves, okay, of this nerve cell. Okay, so what this dendrite do? Okay, so the dendritic tip acquire the information, that the tip of the dendrites, they acquire the information. What do you mean by acquire? They receive the information. Now I am touching a hot object, so that information will be received by the dendritic tip of the nerve cell. Now when this information is acquired, there will be some chemical changes that are taking place at these nerve tips, okay, at this dendritic tip, which will create a electrical impulse. Okay, so it creates an electrical impulse, and in this form the information is being carried through the nerve cell. So once the information is acquired by the dendritic tip, okay, it will be converted into electrical impulse that will pass to the cell body, and from the cell body it will be taken away from the cell body by the axon, and the electrical impulse will then reach the nerve endings, right. So the impulse is carried, or the information is carried through the nerve cell in the form of electrical impulse. I hope this is clear to you, students, right? Okay. Now here is a picture, students, where you can see how the electrical impulse is actually transmitted. I hope this picture is clear to you. Okay. So you can see the dendritic tips which is receiving the information, and this information is then carried in the form of electrical impulse. It reaches the cell body, and from the cell body then it travels through the axon and it will reach the nerve endings of this nerve cell, right. Next we have to learn about the transmission of messages through neurons. That means how the information is passed from one nerve cell to the other nerve cell. Okay, so that is the transmission of the messages through neurons. Now we know, let's consider this to be the first nerve cell and this one to be the second nerve cell, right. Now the first nerve cell, the dendrites of the first nerve cell will receive the stimulus. It will be converted into electrical impulse, and then it will travel through the nerve cell. First it will reach the cell body, then to the axon, and then it will come to the nerve endings, that is the end part of the first nerve cell. Now from the nerve endings it has to be then passed to the dendrite of the second nerve cell, right. So it would be something like this: the nerve endings of the first neuron and the dendritic tips of the second neuron. They are very close to one another, but there is no end-to-end contact. So they are not end-to-end connected, but there is little gap between the two. This gap is called as synapse. Okay, it is called as synapse. See here, it's mentioned. It's called as synapse. So that gap which is seen between the two nerve cells is called synapse, right. Now we have to see what actually happens in this synaptic region, so that the information is being traveled or passed from one nerve cell to the other nerve cell. Okay, so this is one of the synapse, students. This one, this blue structure is the nerve ending of one neuron, and this one is the dendrite of the other neuron. So like this, something like this, one-to-one connection, right. Okay. So the gap which is there between these two, that would be called as the synapse, correct. Okay. So when the electrical impulse reaches the nerve ending of the one neuron, here are the vesicles which have some chemicals in them. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters. We have different types of neurotransmitters. One is mentioned here, dopamine. Dopamine is one kind of a neurotransmitter. So when the electrical impulse reaches the nerve endings, okay, the chemicals which are there in these vesicles are released in the synaptic cleft. So this region between the two nerves, okay, that would be called as synaptic cleft. Now these chemicals are then received by the receptors which are found on the dendrites of the other neuron. Okay. So once these are received by the receptors, it would create a similar kind of electrical impulse in the second nerve cell, and that is how the impulse will be carried through. Okay. I hope this is clear to you, students. Okay, so here is an animated picture where you can see how actually the release of the neurotransmitter is taking place at the synaptic cleft. You can see this chemical that is being released, which is received by the dendrites, right? The receptors on the, which are found on the dendrites, and which will create a similar kind of nerve impulse in the second nerve cell. You can see the impulse which has been carried through the second nerve cell. Okay, so I hope this is clear to you, students, how the information is being transmitted from one nerve cell to the other nerve cell. Okay. Next comes neuromuscular junction. From the name itself, we understand neuromuscular meaning the junction between the nerve cell and the muscle. Now this junction is seen between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. Motor neurons are the neurons which carry the information from the central nervous system to the effector organ. Now here the effector organ is the muscle, because it is bringing the information from the central nervous system. It can be either spinal cord or brain. Okay, so from there the information is been brought and to the effector organ. Here the effector organ is muscle. So what happens at this neuromuscular junction? We can see here the enlarged picture of it. Okay, at the neuromuscular junction we have a synapse. The synapse, something similar to that what we have already studied, which was found between the two nerve cells, right? So again, when the electrical impulse reaches the nerve ending, the chemicals will be released in the synaptic region. These chemicals will be received by the receptors which are found on the muscle cells or muscle fibers, which will make the muscle cell move. Movement of the muscle cell is usually seen by the contraction of the muscles, because they have some special proteins in them which contract, which will cause the movement of the muscle cells. So this is about the neuromuscular junction. Okay, next we need to understand about the reflex action. Now what is this reflex action and why do we need reflex action? Here are the two examples, students, that I have given here. Okay, first one is the knee jerk. What can you see in this picture? Doctor is tapping at the knee of this patient, and this patient all of a sudden he just kicks this doctor, right? Now is he doing this intentionally? No, it just happens all of the sudden, right? It's automatic. So such response which occurs without our knowledge, it just suddenly happens, right? So such type of response is called as reflex action. The second example we can see here, the stimulus is the heat. This person is touching a hot object, okay, and before the person realizes what he has actually done, he has just taken his hand away from the heat and is shouting ouch, right? So that is the response before we realizing what we have already actually done. We have already performed the response, right? So such type of actions are called reflex action. In this reflex action, brain is not involved. Okay, brain is not involved in reflex action, because if brain had to be involved, it would have taken more time, because brain would be involved in the thinking activity. We cannot waste time in thinking, correct? If we waste time in thinking, the damage would already be caused, correct? Okay, so that is why reflex action is very much important to us. Now here is the definition of the reflex action. Reflex action is the extremely quick, automatic, sudden action in response to the stimuli in the environment. So it is a very quick response, automatic and sudden action it is, so which we cannot control, right? Here are some examples of reflex action, like immediately pulling back of the fingers after touching a hot plate. I had already shown the picture of this. Closing of the eyes when flashed with high intensity light, or salivation when hungry. So all these actions are reflex actions that we perform without our will or without our knowledge. Okay. Now what is reflex arc? The path of the reflex action is called reflex arc. So the path through which this reflex action is being carried, okay, that is called as reflex arc. Reflex arc have evolved in animals in order to perform quick responses, as the thinking process of the brain is not fast enough. This is very important, students, because the thinking process of the brain is not fast enough. We need this reflex arc so that we can prevent any damage that would happen, okay, to the body, right? So let me take an example again. You are touching a hot object, okay. So when you are touching the hot object, before you realize that you have touched the hot object, you have already taken your hand away from that particular heat. Okay, so you can see the reflex arc here, students. Here you are touching the hot object, so the receptors in the hand will receive the heat, okay. They will receive the heat that will be then carried through the sensory nerve to the spinal cord. Okay, so the sensory nerve is a nerve which carries the information from the sense organ, okay, to the central nervous system. Now here the central nervous system is the spinal cord. Now here the spinal cord will interpret the information that is been brought by the sensory neuron, and then the information will be carried by the motor neuron to the effector organ. Here the effector organ is the muscle. Okay. Now what is a motor neuron? It is a neuron which carries the information from the central nervous system to the effector organ. Right. Now in between the sensory nerve and the motor nerve, we have another nerve here which is marked as relay neuron. Now what is the function of this relay neuron? It acts as a connection, okay, between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Okay. So when you are touching a hot object, the sensory nerve will carry the information to the spinal cord, and then the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord in this case, will interpret the information, and then the information will be then carried via the motor neuron to the effector organ, and you will take your hand away from the heat. Right. Now when this process is taking place, one nerve is going to the brain, which will send the message to the brain. It means that our brain will know that something has happened to it, but by the time our brain understands what has happened, we have already performed the action. Fine. Okay. So the sensory neuron transmits the impulse from the sense organs towards the central nervous system. So it is a nerve which transmits impulse from the sense organ towards the central nervous system. Relay neuron is the nerve, okay, or this nerve cell which serves as a link between sensory and motor neuron. So it serves as a link between the sensory and motor neuron, and the motor neuron, it transmits impulse from the central nervous system towards the effector organ. Okay. So these are the functions of different kinds of neurons which are involved in reflex arc. I hope this is clear to you, students. Why is reflex arc formed in the spinal cord? Why only in the spinal cord and why not in the brain? Okay. Reflex arc, that is connection between the input nerve and the output nerve. Now here input nerve is the sensory nerve, okay, and the output nerve is the motor nerve. So the reflex arc are made at the point where they first meet each other, that is in the spinal cord. That means the sensory nerve and the motor nerve, they first meet in the spinal cord. Okay. Here nerves from all over the body meet in a bundle on their way to brain. That means, what does this mean? It means that all the nerves that are going to the brain, first they meet in the spinal cord. So this is the place where all the nerves are first meeting. Okay. So therefore reflex arc are formed in the spinal cord, although the input information also goes on to reach the brain. Fine. So that is why reflex arc is formed in the spinal cord. Now here you can see, students, how the information is been carried by the sensory nerve, okay, by the sensory nerve to the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord the information is then travelling through the motor nerve, and it is reaching the effector organ. Once it reaches the effector organ, you can see the response, right. Again you can see here the information which has been travelling through the sensory nerve, right. It will reach the spinal cord, then from the spinal cord via the motor neuron, the information will be carried to the effector organ, which will show the response, that is movement of the leg. Okay. So this is reflex action. This is the pathway to show the reflex arc. Stimulus, here in this case the stimulus is the heat which has been received by the receptors which are found in the skin. Okay. This information will be then travelling through the sensory nerves to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord the information will then be carried via the motor nerves to the effector organ, that is the muscles. And now these muscles will respond that is the response is withdrawal of the hand. Okay. So, this is the reflex arc. Students, with this I stop my discussion for today. The remaining part of the chapter we will discuss in the second part of this lesson. Till then, bye.